Hello, welcome to Creating Portland. I'm your host, Pearson Kunz, and on this podcast, I'll be interviewing progressive creators who are using their art to shape the culture of our city and beyond. I hope you enjoy this episode of Creating Portland. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Creating Portland. We have a super exciting guest today. His name is Terry, and he moved to Portland over 15 years ago, where he attended PNCA, and he received an illustration degree. Then from there, he's been working professionally in comic books ever since. He's published 2 graphic novels of his own, with another coming out this year, which I'm excited to get into. And then he's also written comic book tie-ins for shows like Rick and Morty, Steven Universe, and Adventure Time. And then recently he also, which I'm so excited to talk about, wrote a comic book for Ariana Grande to promote her new fragrance, which I didn't even know about the fragrance, but Ariana Grande, honey, yes. And then also, of course, probably one of the most exciting pieces of news is that he's working on a Marvel comic for Marvel called Reptile. So let's welcome to the pod, Terry. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Yes. Well, let's jump right in because these credits, I mean, whew, I'm ready to go. But let's start with just Terry, in your own words, how are you creating Portland? As vague or specific as you want to be in that.
I think I'm a small part of a large group that is creating this artistic kind of subculture in Portland. And what I mean by that is I think a lot of people underestimate or maybe don't know because of the circles they run in, how many comic book artists and writers live in Portland. I'm willing to bet that if you look at the types of artists that live here, like sculptors or painters or whatever, the most prevalent kind of artist is comic book artist. And that's because, excuse me, for a long time now, Dark Horse Comics and Oni Press have been located in Portland. And then Image Comics moved here to Portland. There's some great conventions in Portland and Seattle. So people move here. I certainly moved here to like, at the suggestion of one of my good friends, to like, meet people, to start working in comics, to network. And I think that comic book artists have this great sort of way of like kind of lifting up the city and making it something that, you know, is fun and exciting. But I don't think a lot of people know that about Portland. Maybe some people do in the circles I read in, but yeah, I think that a lot of people in Portland may not know that, but it's definitely the case.
I mean, I definitely had no idea that that was such a predominant medium here. And that's why I'm so excited to talk to you about it. What do you see as like, so that's exciting that this community is here. What about you specifically? What do you bring to the community and what do you bring to maybe comics, but just Portland in general as an artist?
I feel like in a way, what I bring is maybe a little bit more, hopefully, even though I'm very white passing, a little bit more diversity. I don't know too many other Latinos or Mexicans in Portland. I'm Mexican American. And I think that from what I understand, Portland is one of, if not the whitest major city in the country. And so I think that it's something that hopefully I can bring in terms of like some short educational comics that I did that they talk about. They're a little bit more autobiographical. They talk about like living in Portland, being Mexican American, what the terms Latino and Hispanic mean. That one went viral for some crazy reason. But yeah, nice. I think that hopefully personally I can bring like a sense of, you know, there are Latinos that live here, there are Mexicans that live here, and that we're as the Latinx community, we are the largest ethnic minority group in the country with the least amount of representation across the board. And we also, before COVID, put more money into purchasing like movie tickets every weekend, buying lots of books and comics. Like we consume a lot of entertainment. And It's something like 25% of all movie ticket sales. So like that's a whole quarter of that market. But
Right.
I'm rambling now. But yeah, I feel like hopefully in terms of like bringing bringing something artistic to Portland, I hope that people when they encounter my work may feel a little sense of like, wait, he's Mexican American, he's Latino, and he lives in Portland. So I hope that
Mhm.
maybe even have that reaction.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely exciting representation for our city to have cool artists like you here, which is why I'm so excited to talk to you about like how you're representing our city. I guess what I'm curious about is you have these connections and these gigs, I guess, with these huge national, international. We're talking Marvel, we're talking Ariana Grande, which to me, like Ariana Grande is bigger than Marvel in my community. But like how does Portland situate itself to have access to those things, or maybe it's you specifically? Can you kind of talk about that connection to the bigger artistic community in that way, living here?
Sure. In terms of something like Marvel, I feel like that's something that came to me because of the years of work I've put in and reaching out to my agent, the books that I've done previously. But I wouldn't have been able to do that work had I not networked with and became a member of Helioscope Studio, which is a collective of comic book artists in downtown Portland. Um,
Hmm.
and I feel like because in Portland, that community sort of lifts each other up and we are like there for each other, that led me to do the work that then got me, some of the gigs that I have now. Um, in terms of something like Ariana Grande, I don't know that has some much to do with Portland. I likely can't say much about this job, not for any reason other than like signing legal paperwork. But that's more of like networking with artists. I had a friend who suggested me to write this comic. Um, and I'm sorry to disappoint you. I never spoke to her. I never like chatted with her, but definitely like wrote this comic for her based off of ideas that she had and wanted to sort of bring to this campaign for her fragrance.
Yeah, and can you speak a little more then to like just uh, just networking in an age where it's beyond just Portland. Like we are our own community of artists, which is exciting, but then it's so interconnected to all of these other artists across the country. So how does that work for you?
Pre-COVID, for me, it was a lot about conventions, like comic book
Okay.
conventions. Those are very draining, they can take a lot of energy out of you, but they were important for like meeting people in terms of like other artists and meeting editors. I met my agent at a convention um, in New York. And I think that, yeah, it's a little bit easier to network in the age of the internet. Um, and for me, I try to see networking as two things. One of them is just making friends, and the
Mm-hmm.
other one is um, building like a relationship of trust with that person. And so I think that when you're a kid and you're like coming up with ideas or you're drawing or whatever, you kind of just want to like hang out and make stuff with your friends. You want to play with your friends. And so for me as an adult, I feel like what would be better than like making comics with your friends, other people who are
Mm-hmm.
artists, who you trust, who you know. And I tried to do that in art school at PNCA as well. It's like try to get to know people so that you have a good support system, a good friend group, but also like who knows what if you are going to work in comics and you put out a book, you might need a bio photo one day, and then do you know any people who do photography, you know things like that. I think that networking is definitely a little bit easier in today's day and age, but I see it more as like making friends and acquaintances, because people can tell when your networking is ingenuine because you're just networking because you're just like, I just want to get to know this person because I think they can give me jobs. Like, are you asking this person genuine questions? Are you interested in their work? I think there's a definite difference, and people can tell the difference.
And so, yeah, Completely agree. Do you then feel like Portland is your long-term artistic home, or what keeps you here in Portland? Why Portland?
This is a conversation I have with my husband all the time. um, Sometimes I'm the type of person who, if I can't afford it, it doesn't exist to me. I don't even think about it. So
Mm.
so when when we have these conversations, it's kind of like, well, where would you like to live one day? Do you always want to live in Portland? And I'm like, I don't know. I haven't really thought about this. The older I get, I will say, the more connected to and the I feel to Mexico.
Mm.
And I love Mexico, and I feel like it's definitely much cheaper to live there, and it's a beautiful city, Mexico City anyway. And I wouldn't
Mhm.
mind having a small place there and contributing to like being an artist there in that city. Um, but I've lived all over. I was raised in Boise, Idaho, and then moved to several different places in Mexico where my mom is from. But I've lived in New York and I've lived in Los Angeles. Um, I don't know. I could live in several different places, I think, but I'm happy in the Portland area. I I moved here to get away from the sunshine, as crazy as that sounds. Um, I
That's
was
why
in
people
Los
leave.
I was in Los Angeles. It was like December, and I walked out of work and it was like 75 degrees. I was sweating instantly,
Mhm.
and I knew the minute I got in my car, I was going to get like a third-degree burn from the steering wheel. And I was like, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. And my friend was like, just moved to Portland, and she was living here. So I was like, all right. And by March, I was here, the March following that December. Yeah.
Okay, well, that kind of actually brings us into our second section, which is just in terms of the Portland artistic scene, what is working for you about it? What do you see as being successful in Portland arts? And then what is maybe not working so well that we need to work on improving?
Um, I would say that this is sort of a strange answer. I would say that one thing that definitely works for me as a Portland artist, I use the term artist as writer and artist. I still do plenty of illustration for different magazines or for comics or whatever. But I would say that what works for me is that when you live in Portland and you have a job like the one I do, it's and it rains like 7 months out of the year here. It's very conducive to staying inside and working all day. And so
Mm-hmm,
I do
mm-hmm.
feel like that has contributed to, me being productive and me like sort of delving into my work, feeling like, well, I'm gonna go live in this world for a while and write this book. Not as an escape to like the rain or whatever, but I do think that, if I were to live in like Palm Springs, which I love, I would probably be, I'm gonna go out by the pool or I'm gonna go for a walk or whatever. Um, and so I think that honestly, partly the weather is another great reason. Um, it's something that definitely contributes to my work. I don't know what the city might be like lacking in terms of, I guess, in a way, what I think would help is for the institutions that are here, like the schools and whatnot, to embrace the idea that people move here and go to school here to learn how to be comic book artists.
Mm. What
And
do you mean by
when I went to PNCA, I got a
that?
lot
Hmm.
out of my education there because for one thing, I was like 25 when I started there. Everyone else around me was 18. And I only say that because I feel like I was at a point where I was like ready to get my degree and be done and start working. And
Mm.
I had I had lived in a few different places and I was just sort of like ready to like move into that space. But the illustration department was still very new when I went there. And I loved all my instructors. I thought they were all great. I got a lot out of my time there, but I also felt like the best way to put this, the illustration department, I'm under the impression, was the fastest growing department at that school, which meant that it had the most students, which to me meant that that was who was contributing the most tuition to that school.
Right.
And I didn't have any courses about comic books. And I would say that half of the people that I knew in the illustration department wanted to work in comics. So I
Mm,
feel like that's
mm,
something that, I've talked to students at the school before. I've given like talks or lectures or whatever to different classes. And I definitely think it's different now. I think they have embraced a little bit of that, and they have some graphic novel, comic book, sequential storytelling courses and classes. But again, I think maybe any art school, it's not PNCA, I think any art school wants to be known for like, this alumni from this year has a gallery showing in New York with their performance
mm.
or their sculpture or their paintings. And for better for worse, comic book artists, the work that we do, it doesn't end up in a gallery most of the time. It ends up in a store. And I think because of that, some people in artistic communities don't see it as artistic of an expression or thing. And so I
Fascinating.
think, yeah,
No, keep going. I mean, this is riveting. Why do you think it is that that is sort of less legitimized, and how do we get there?
um, there's a few reasons. One of them I think is that up until recently, I don't think comic books have garnered sort of the respect in the United States that they, I think, are starting to get in certain places. Um, I also think this with animation as well. I think that the United States is one of a few countries that view comics and animation as entertainment for children. Um,
Mm,
Japan doesn't think that way. All of their soap operas and dramas are like anime. I mean, they have live action ones too, but um, in France, comics are this medium that definitely are geared towards adults as well as children. It's just images, it's just drawings on a page telling a story,
right.
and so I think that's part of it because comics are still seen as like I did have one experience where in post school where I was asked to come do like portfolio reviews, and it was being led by someone else. And that after the reviews, several of the students who'd had their portfolios reviewed, we were all going to this gallery showing to look at an artist who was a former alumni that had some paintings in this gallery. And
Okay.
students wanted to, on the way, stop in the comic book shop, which was
Mm,
on the way there. And the person leading this was like, well, we need to do this. We need to head here because the artwork of an alumni from this school is in this gallery. Meanwhile, I had 2 issues of a comic
in
in the
that
comic book
shop.
shop. And I'm like, I'm an
Mm,
alumni. I have artwork in because it's a store and because it's a comic book store,
mm.
it's not as revered to you as this painting from someone who graduated, here as well. Um, yeah, he did. I said, I'm alumni. I have art. I'm very outspoken. I'm the type of person that feels like I don't have time to deal with, you know, something like that. So I just said, well, I think we should listen to the students. The students want to stop in here. There's artwork all over this store, and there are alumni that have work in here. And he was like,
Right.
who? And I said, me. And so, yeah.
Well,
So,
yeah, there's this elitism
yeah,
to if the common consumer can appreciate this art, then it must not be like
yes.
as valid as this higher art that average people don't have access to.
That's just it. And it has very much to do, I think, with money. You can buy a comic
Hmm.
book for $3.
Right.
But this, if the school has someone successful in a gallery showing
Hmm.
in New York, their piece could go for thousands of dollars or whatever, and suddenly it's very legitimate. So
Yeah.
as if all the movies that we watch today aren't based on comic books.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, there is like a part of the like inner piece of me that's like, oh, a Marvel movie is somehow less of a film than a film is. And so it's like there is this weird pretension almost to
I mean,
even having that as source material, maybe.
sure, but I think that, if we just view comic books as are as like mythology, superheroes as like mythology. Think of it like Greek mythology.
Right.
These heroes with powers and they can turn into things and whatever. then those are just stories that I think, resonate with people for different reasons. The Marvel book that I'm doing right now, it's about a Mexican American teenage superhero that can turn into dinosaurs. And on the surface, that sounds like, okay, cool, like kids are gonna love this. But at the same time, when I started writing it, I was like, I'm not very familiar with this character. And does that say something in regards to I am now
Mm,
writing a book about a Mexican American hero, about like visibility for this community that I belong to? Like, this should be a known character, and there's no reason why it can't be. Um, I I do think there's that, was it Scorsese, like, meh, comic book movies.
yep.
But
Yeah.
that's also a very narrow, in my opinion, view. My favorite comic book movie of all time is Ghost World. And that's like the Scarlett Johansson, um, Thora Birch, Steve Buscemi movie. That's based on a comic. American Splendor is based on a comic. And so people, before I got this Marvel gig, I would tell people that I wouldn't tell a lot of people that I worked in comics if they asked, because then it leads to questions like, oh, cool, like Spider-Man? And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, my first comic book, my first graphic novel is a queer murder mystery set at a fat camp. And they're like, oh,
Yes.
okay. And they don't know how to take that. Yeah.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think that, comics,
Yeah, and
we
I
look
think.
at comics the way we look at movies and TV. Are there horror TV
Hmm.
shows? Are there action TV shows? Are there dramas? Are there comedies?
Mm.
There's all of that for comics. Superhero is just one, genre within comics.
Yeah, and I'm also fascinated by this point you bring up of like the intended audience being children and that being somehow less legitimate too. Of like just because it's for kids, how does that make it less of a art form, less of a medium, lesser in any way, just because the audience is somehow
As if we didn't consume things as children that informed the type of artists that we want
right?
to be as adults. I mean,
Yes.
I would say the intended audience for the Ariana Grande comic was likely not little kids. It was Ariana Grande fans. And her fans
Right.
range, I think, in age from like teens to, adults. And so
Yep.
suddenly you have people who maybe have never read a comic book before, who really want this comic book now because of who it's associated with, and the character in it is her. I also think that there's a great way that comics, especially, so I did the You Say Latino, which was an autobiographical short comic about the terms Latino and Hispanic, and it talked a little bit about my
Hmm.
life and how those terms aren't the same thing, how they don't mean the same thing. And people read that, it went viral, and suddenly there was a discourse around the time, I think like 2016, about what those terms meant. And I said, yeah, if there's a time to talk about what those terms mean, and if a comic is what brought that to, light,
Mm.
then I think that's great. You hand someone a pamphlet with columns of text and they're like, thanks, I'll read it later. You hand someone a comic book and they're going to start reading it right away. They're,
Yeah, there's no reason to not.
yeah. And so I think that people underestimate educational comics and how those
Mm.
things can also bring a topic that might be difficult to understand or explain into some simple terms and into a story that people then consume and understand a little bit better.
Yes. Oh, I'm getting psyched about comics right now in a way that I never have. And I'm like, okay, I'm a huge
I
comic fan all of a
followed that up
sudden.
with a comic called You Say Latinx, because
Okay.
I had been hearing that term quite a bit. Spanish is a gendered
Hmm.
language. And so for people who are gender fluid or gender non-binary, like what term do they use? To use the O as Latino, that says you're male, and to use the A, that says you're female. And what if you identify as both or neither or what? So a lot of people use the X, but because a lot of like an older generation who speaks Spanish, they can't wrap their head around it. They don't understand,
Hmm.
why would you use this? Why do we need this? Like if you refer to a group of Latinos, men and women,
Hmm.
you in Spanish, you always use the O. So they're like, but there
Right.
already is one for it's an O, and but you're still using the male form. So I did this comic that just talked about um, what some of those things mean, those terms mean, and why that term is important. It has this like me in front of a blackboard with like Latinx, like explaining that term. And, I think people actually got a lot out of it because I was able to say, a lot of people push up against this because they say you can't change every gendered vowel in Spanish. You can't speak it anymore. It makes Spanish like unconjugatable. To say like the
Mhm.
kids went to school to see their friends, like los niños fueron a la escuela para ver a sus amigos. You'd have to be like lixus niñixes, so that's how they push back.
Mhm.
It's like you can't speak it. I
Yeah.
heard somebody on TV use an E instead of the O or the A.
Mm.
And suddenly, if you welcome someone, bienvenidos todos, all you have to do is say bienvenidas todas and use the E, and you've been inclusive. And in a comic, through this comic, I hope I was able to tell people like, look, language changes all the time. It just does. Like you think it doesn't, but
Yeah.
it does. And it's something that I think that if I feel like it was a comic that hopefully said that I feel that what the most basic thing we can do as human beings is refer to other people the way they want to be referred to. And
Right.
if this comic can do that in like 6 pages and help someone understand that, then I think that's something actually really powerful that comics can do.
Totally. I mean, just another conversation about accessibility, and like I think a lot of the discourse right now in the semantic realm and in like liberal dialogue is around all of these complicated things that we're
Mhm.
trying to figure out and sort through. And so to have this medium that like breaks it down, de-intellect. I mean, it's still the same concept, but it's more accessible
Yeah.
to children, to people that aren't engaged in this conversation every day. They can read this and get out what they need to in a practical way rather than getting a paper or a book, or even like sometimes articles are just too much to just explain all this stuff we're trying to figure out together.
And there's plenty of text in a comic. I think you just trick people into not thinking
Right.
there is. And they've suddenly, at the end of the 6, 7 page thing, been like, oh, I did read this thing and now I grasp this concept.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it's people talking, it's more personable, it's less like black and white
There's also
text on a
it's why we love movies and TV. There's a definite power
page.
in combining words with pictures because you now provide a context for what's happening in this space. And I think
Yeah.
that people don't always understand that that's what comics do. Great comics, in my opinion, combine words and pictures in an interesting way. If you already have a picture of someone doing like at the grocery store, why would your caption or your dialogue say, I'm at the grocery store?
Mm,
Is your story more interesting if you say like, I think that our relationship is not working or something. And I'd be like, why is she at the grocery store thinking about this? I'd be like so into this. I'd be like, well, now I need to read more. Who is she talking to? Yeah,
mm-hmm. I mean, it's even making me think like that is the definition of meme culture too, is this combination of
mhm,
words and photos together to create some kind of interesting, relatable
absolutely.
story.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. This has been absolutely riveting. Okay, our last final question. I just want to talk to you forever about this. But what I guess is your hope then for Portland art or comic art? What's the dream for you, the big vision in terms of where we're all headed?
We spoke about it a little bit, but my I would hope that for Portland and for the world that
Mm-hmm.
people would start to see or recognize that comics are a medium and they're not all superheroes.
Mm,
A very powerful sort of genre of graphic novels right now is the autobio thing.
right.
My agent has been pushing me to do one, and I was like, I don't know, like why? And she's like, you're a biracial, bicultural, ex-Mormon, Mexican American gay person who grew up in Boise, Idaho, and Mexico in the '90s.
Yes,
And I was
there's
like,
got to be something.
okay, I'll try to write something then. And so, I think that if we can expand our idea of what comic books are, clearly
Mm.
I'm literally wearing like a Marvel Latinx, like X-Men shirt right now.
Yeah.
I'm a Marvel fan. I love Marvel. I love working for them. I grew up with like the X-Men, reading all those comics, watching the cartoons. I will always love superhero stuff, but
Mm.
I want people to recognize that comics are a great, vast, wide medium and not a superhero genre.
Mm.
You could draw any picture of anything and combine it with words, draw one more picture, combine it with words, and that's a comic book. It could be about whatever you want.
Mm. I mean, I feel like I'm getting schooled today as well. I definitely came in with this Marvel mindset going on, and I just have grown in so much appreciation.
But so you could, if you expand your horizon a little bit, you could be reading an Ariana Grande comic book.
I could. I mean, if I had known there was an Ariana Grande comic book, I would absolutely be devouring it.
Listen, that fragrance smells amazing. I actually wear it every day.
Okay, so this is good product promotion. You've actually tried it. You actually can root for it. Okay, I'll have to check out the fragrance as well, I guess, but I'll start with the comic. And
Great.
yeah, thank you so much for being here, Terry.
Of course.
How can people find you on the internet or follow you, or where do we get the deets? Hello?
Sorry, I was giving it a second because it was like freezing up.
Oh,
you can find me on my website. It's terryblas@gmail.com. And my Twitter and my Instagram, where I post my thoughts and my artwork, are just at Terry Blas. It's just my name. They said in art school be easy to find. So,
yes.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Well, make sure to check those out. And thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Creating Portland with me, Pearson Kunz. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. And check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Creating PDX, or on our website, creatingpdx.com. This podcast was brought to you by Wolf and Thunder Productions and Golden Pride Productions. See you next time. Bye!